So I want to talk about the computational framework that we developed over the last essentially like 15 years, the adaptive spiking neural networks framework, and how we apply it in practice and some dynamical tasks and some examples where it might excel in future. So yeah, me and my team, we used to work for Russian Academy of Science for quite a time, and we did research in bio-inspired computations and evolutionary computing and application of mathematical topology to analysis of neural networks and so on. And yeah, so let's start our topic. So brain-inspired neural networks is kind of emerging field now because some brain-like AI have some advantages over traditional deep learning, which is in ability to train online and train on few examples, having less data sets and maybe train faster with faster conversions. And spiking neural networks in difference with regular deep learning, they operate with essentially spikes like our neurons in our brain. And we do this research in our company now. So, as I said, spiking neural networks have some advantages, but deep learning itself has some issues in practical applications because it's quite hard to apply deep learning in real dynamical world setups because deep learning needs some pre-training with big data sets, and it's not essentially the dynamical system. So most of deep learning models, they kind of frozen in their inference time, and this is not very good in ever-changing environment. Yeah, so spiking neural networks can help us to overcome these limits of deep learning. They're dynamic, and they have internal dynamics, like recurrent internal dynamics, and very good at future learning and able to be resistant to some noise and maybe failures. But spiking neural networks have some issues as well. So they're very hard to train because if we train them with backpropagation like algorithms, that destroys some of the possibilities of spiking neural networks, because the global, so-called global learning, when you use backpropagation, it just doesn't allow so the whole network to learn the different patterns, and local learning in contrary can allow us to find some patterns or correlated activities in the input data stored in some part of networks and not affecting the memories that already formed, for example. That's why continual learning is a very good application for spiking neural networks. But it's also very hard to interpret the signal when it's going through the spiking neural networks. It essentially loses the nature of information itself, and it's very hard to reconstruct the data from the activity of spiking neural networks. And we try to solve these issues in our research. So if you will have kind of general look on our framework, you can find different levels. So first level is learning, synaptic learning itself. We do resource restricted rules, which I will describe later, to allow us to efficiently train the spiking neural networks. We also have kind of compartmental-based structure of learning inside of our simulated cells, which have some temporal dynamics and temporal learning inside of it. So we start with learning correlational dynamics or in the input data, and also then recognize the patterns of these correlations and try to identify these patterns and react in a way that will be efficient for the network to function. And on the top level, we can build cortical inspired architectures with ability to have the predictive coding inside of this architectures. I will talk about it step by step now. So the real neural cells, they consist of different parts like dendrites and organelles and so on. And in order to grow weights, synaptic weights, they need to have an actual proteins delivered to these synaptic connections. And this delivery, it takes some energy, it takes some time, and at the same time, the cell have to maintain the homeostasis and essentially not to die from overexcitation, for example. So that's a very hard boundary on activity and on plasticity proteins that have to be delivered to grow synapses. And we have found that it might be beneficial constraint on synaptic growth, and we have built the model of constraining of regular spike time dependent plasticity. Unfortunately, I forgot to include the slide about spike time dependent plasticity, but essentially that's a Hebbian learning approach where you, as the previous speaker described, when you have two neural cells that co-fire together, the linkage or connection between them strengthened. So yeah, and we developed the model that regularizes the spike time dependent plasticity by applications restricted local pool of proteins that are used to grow the synapse strength. And we control the firing frequency of the cell by different amount of this emitting of these proteins, simulated proteins in our networks. This allow us to go from unconstrained growth to constrained growth and efficiently achieve the heterosynaptic plasticity, which is essentially when some of synapses grows in expense of other synapses. And the synapses that represent the strongly correlated signals, they grow much faster. This allows this STDP plasticity rule to excel on determining the correlated signals. So here is a comparison of our PPD, pool-dependent plasticity rule, with STDP and homeostatic synaptic plasticity. It's quite kind of deep to touch, but in our research, we have showed that our rule allows to determine the correlated signals on top of some noise and even high frequency noise with very high efficiency in difference with classical approach. And this allows to have like stable learning, not losing the signals in the process of training. Here's the example where we applied the frozen noise patterns on the network, and as a result, we end up with neurons that selectively activate by different patterns. So with this plasticity rule, we can essentially recognize any kind of special signals, but not really the time series signals. For the time series signals, we need something to process the time series. And here on the right image, you can see the activations of each particular neurons with different colors, the green, orange, and blue. And you can also find that these patterns and these reactions on frozen noise, they are quite kind of stable and resembling each other. So that's essentially the repetitive pattern motifs that we can recognize further. Yeah, so for the internal activity models, the different approach can be used. It might be like Izhikevich models, famous model, or maybe liquid integrated fire models, for example. The liquid integrated fire models, they essentially represent some nonlinear function, and with some threshold, when the neuron achieves some threshold, it produces spikes, and when it produces spikes, it resets to some kind of basic state, and then the dynamics starts again. And we can also, this is not learnable system basically. So this system that we can feed with hands, with parameters to have some kind of dynamics that we want, maybe bursting dynamic or single spike dynamic, different kinds. But for learning of desired activity of neural cells, for example, generalized linear models are used where the input filter and recurrent filter are all learnable functions, and they essentially fit it to some example of recorded neural data, and it showed that such simple models can represent any kind of spiking patterns in neural systems. But we work with the task of machine learning of applications of this model. So we need the cell dynamics to represent the complex and unknown patterns in unsupervised way. So for this reason, we use basically the system which is represented by a set of filters. Each of filters is a set of Laguerre orthonormal basis functions, and the strong side of this pattern of this functions is that with very few parameters we can represent quite long time series data. So for example, with 30 basic functions, we can compress the 10,000 steps of time series data and efficiently reproduce it further. And we also use leak integrated fire model on the output of our neural cells to have some regularized dynamics with optimal kind of behavior for our networks. But the internal dynamics is fully learnable. Yeah, so more about this. So you can see here the three filters. The external filter E, which is responsible for interconnections with different compartments of different cells. Maybe it's kind of can be represented in neuroscience way as a gap junction between different compartments or between different cells. And K filter is responsible for input signal itself, which is going from the dendrites, and on the dendrites we have our modified STDP connections and CDP weights updates rules. And H filter represents the recurrent flow in this model. And each of them essentially is a Laguerre filter bank, and it forms the complete Laguerre-Volterra model, which we can train with different approach. So we can basically train it with gradient descent, and we tried it. So on the image to the left, you can see more bigger image of the basic functions of Laguerre polynomials, but yeah, it can be much more functions, and if you add more functions, you can fit it to more complex regression tasks, for example. Yeah, so for our tasks, we, for example, used different goal output sets to have it fire on when it recognizes some like enhanced activity in the inputs, for example. Yeah, so we can fit the Laguerre filter bank. You can see ln, x, and so on equation here, and we can fit it with different algorithms. Training with back propagation is kind of and with gradient descent is kind of demanding in terms of resources, and we came to the system where we trained the Laguerre-Volterra model with model predictive control approach, where we can essentially at the end we can use the linear optimization technique and train these networks with quite fast and efficient, basically. And also for training, we need some supervision, some signal, and for recognition of patterns inside of this input signal data, we use motive discovery as a supervision signal. The motive discovery basically is that's procedure of finding the similar patterns inside of time series data, for example. So here you can see 3 repetitive patterns, and on the matrix of distance matrix, it's the closest possible parts, and we can this way we can recognize that this is the pattern, and we probably can either ignore it or either we can react to the pattern. It depends on the tuning or what kind of neuron we want to achieve here. Yeah, so we solve the model predictive control with Laguerre basis functions, and achieved essentially the learning of these functions very fast and efficient, and we just need several steps to converge on these tasks. So yes, and when we got like the dynamical system for one compartment, we can also construct any arbitrary topology of these cells. So we can make a compartmental cells which might resemble any kind of real existing or non-existing real neural cells, and solve different kind of tasks. For example, when we combine several such nodes, we achieve the time series data. Good. So yeah. I have showed you that with adaptive spiking neural networks, we can have spatial and temporal dynamics, but that's all unsupervised approach to training. But in order to train some kind of signals, we need reinforcement learning, for example. And here we can show that in the real brain, the basic activities of several of many cells, it can be just non-learnable. So the learnable curve until you add some neuromodulators, it's just silent. So it's not learning anything until you add, for example, dopamine or noradrenaline. So this addition of some neuromodulators makes the learning curves different. So it's very much resembles the RSTDP approach, where you change the slopes of learning functions with addition of some reinforcement signal. And we made universal kind of STDP curves of learning, which allow us to modulate and have different basic activities, different kinds of basic activities for desired groups of neural cells in our models. And to the information retrieval part. As I said, when you start to train your spiking neural networks, it essentially loses the original information. And to not lose it, for example, when we work with sound data, with, for example, speaker identification data, and we try to identify people by their voice, we need to keep this voice and to have the voice on output and have the voice on input and have the mix of voice on input and have the particular voices on output. So we still need the data. And to extract the data, we use on each layer of our networks, we use a simple encoder, decoder, autoencoder model, which extract and recovers the input from each neuron layer, what kind of input it get and what kind of activity it provides. So given the activity of neurons, it learns to recover the initial input, and layer by layer we keep the signal, and not only keep it but also recognize which part of neural population keeps or transfer what kind of signal. Yeah, so when we have the models of and already working the models of neural cells and compartmental neural cells, we can proceed to more like an architectural patterns. And it's curious that in our brain we have the cortical columns, which represents essentially as a kind of recurrent and self-tuning subnetworks, and we also build such an architectures in our research. And we also can make a different kind of cells or nodes. Some cells might, as I said, recognize the pattern itself, and it will be the prediction neurons. And some cells learn to ignore the current patterns, and this makes them kind of anomaly detection cells or error processing cells in predictive coding language. So we can build different kind of predictive brain architectures with our neural networks, and even the recent discovery that predictive processing may happen not only on level of intraneural interactions, but also on compartments of neurons. And we also may build such a compartmental neurons where some parts represent the signal itself, some parts represent the error to the signal, and this two-directional movement between the kind of predictions and expectations. So yeah. And it was mentioned the work of Carl Friston on predictive processing, and I consider that the described framework also may be used for building the complete prediction processing architecture, where we would have some prediction error neurons, some expectation neurons, and precision neurons as well, which is essentially the neuromodulating signals. And we have all of this in our framework. Yeah, so we can now probably move to applications of such networks. The best applications for adaptive spiking neural networks, that's kind of dynamical tasks. So, for example, text-to-speech for multiple speakers or diarization. When we apply the tip neural networks to this task, we try to pre-train on types of human voices, but in reality our brain doesn't work like this. It has some pre-training for each particular voice that we hear, and it's very fast to converge to recognition of particular person. And that's for all possible tasks. It's the same. We work with dynamical kind of tasks, and I will try to cover it. So yeah, I said about text-to-speech diarization. So for text-to-speech diarization, we can use our spiking neural networks to achieve the recognition of particular voices. We also found that our networks are very good for anomaly detection, just with a few of these neurons. But basically, that's not the neurons in regular sense of neural networks, but it's submodels or subnetworks, I would say. But still, with some of this, with very few of these nodes, we can process time series data from industrial machines like wind turbines or any different kind of industrial turbines, basically. And we can detect the anomalies inside of the data of the turbines. We just put the bunch of our neurons and some input data to it, and it automatically feeds to the data and to the current background activity of these turbines. And after some time, it will react only to some anomaly, something different which is going inside of the system. So for anomaly detection with, for example, deep learning algorithms, you will need a lot of data, not a lot of compute. It will be hard to compute on edge, for example, and also it's very hard to train because for example, each wind turbine has different structure, basically. That even if it made by one producer, but wind turbines are very special, each of them. So you need some kind of algorithms that will adapt to each particular object. And in our research, we can just build a small anomaly detection neuron, which will recognize the anomalies in the data of particular turbine and will fit to one particular object. Yeah. So as I said already, this less resource hungry approach, we can build it into just several GPUs or even one FPGA. Also, spiking neural networks, they're essentially very good fit for event-based cameras. The event-based cameras, it's a kind of different kind of visual sensors that from what we mostly meet in our lives. So event-based cameras, they work with events when the intensity of the signal in some particular pixels it changes rapidly. It can be on events when we detect some increases in the signal, or it can be off events as well. And this kind of cameras, they just represent only these events, not the whole pictures. It has some advantages, like they're very energy efficient, data efficient. They represent only changes in this data, and also they have very big dynamic diapason, so they're very good for example for autonomous driving tasks. And the spiking neural networks is natural fit for this kind of vision sensors. Okay, so we can basically process this DVS, so digital visual sensors outputs, recognize objects, velocities, and so on from it, and we may build even kind of conceptual understanding of the pictures if we build the right architectures here. We also see the big potential for adaptive spiking neural networks in radar and lidar sensing. So in radar and lidar sensing, we have problems with cancellation of noise and many maybe reflecting objects and so on. So we need some adaptive algorithm which will work in real time on edge inside of the car, for example, that will be able to kind of adapt to sudden changes in the environment, to like precipitation, for example. And yes, spiking neural networks here are very good fit for this kind of tasks, and for leaders as well. So the main prevention of application of leaders, it's precipitation, which, so for example, snow destroys the image really better. And current algorithms of noise reduction, they are not very adaptive. They actually need to have some fitting parameters that we fit basically by experiment, and with adaptive spiking neural networks, you can just run the network, and it will automatically learn to recognize stable patterns and correlations and time series inside of the data, but it will ignore the noise data, like noise from the rain. Okay. We can even build for a complete model of the control of drone visual navigation with radars and visual cameras. It's one of the projects which we'll initiate. Yeah, we are also very much interested in kinematic free control of robots, and I think that this exciting field that will allow robots to be in our lives more, like in real life, so for our existence. With kinematic free control, we can use spiking neural networks to control the robots with reinforcement, with no kind of big pre-training, and just a few attempts to control the robot. So basically, a robot has no pre-learned like patterns or gates of walking, and it just learns from interacting with the environment in real manner. But in regular reinforcement learning approach, so to based, for example, on deep learning, you need many thousand steps of experiments, and with adaptive spiking neural networks, you can just wait for like 100 attempts, and the robot starts to learn the posture. Yes. And what's also very interesting for us is medical signals. I think that in medical signals we have a big potential to change life of people if we will be able to, for example, recognize and adaptively process on the go EEG signal or EMG signal. EMG signals, it's electrical signals from our muscles, and with spiking neural networks, that's a project that we initiate now with our colleagues. We will be able to control prosthetic limbs and also sensitize the patients, for example, without limbs, or patients who are not very able to move. For example, we want to connect them to virtual reality. Yeah, I think I'm done here.
Any questions? Sorry, are there any questions? If so, I will ask a question. So, like in spirit that our next presentation is going to be about like alignment theories and interpretability. Uh, what is the state of kind of like you said there is many applications to reinforcement learning. What is like the equivalent um of is there any kind of theories of interpretability or theories of um like uh, alignment in like reinforcement learning tasks for spiking neural networks?
Uh, I'm not sure, but what do you mean by interpretability in reinforcement learning tasks? So maybe you can little bit describe.
Like, is there anything you can tell? Is like there's a lot of like research in neurodynamics with like semantic maps in a human brain, and there is also like this manifold hypothesis we discussed in previous talk, is there anything similar for spiking neural networks? Like I imagine they represent stuff in like for yet like a frequency space, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there are different kind of coding approach. So like frequency coding or spike time coding, for example, but population coding and so on for this. But in my opinion, for practical applications, we need this kind of neural network on the coding side on each layer. We in our research we use the deep neural network on each layer of our networks to kind of reconstruct the signal and interpret what the actual what the actual kind of neurons or nodes what they see in the input data, and this way we kind of reconstruct it. It might be compared to experiments when researchers they connect some kind of reading like ECOG or maybe very high high kind of very precise EEG to the brain, and they try to reconstruct from the population activity of real brain what person is seeing now from visual cortex, for example. Here we
Yeah.
do the same, but we do this in simulated way, and this allows us to use the deep neural networks on each particular cells and to reconstruct it. So that's very similar to what neuroscientists are doing when they try to reconstruct the visual imagery data. They also use deep learning mostly.
Thank you. Anyone? Any other questions by anyone?
A side question. I was wondering if you would know if you're talking about for robotics and kinematic models, would that be something like Boston Dynamic uses, or like is there anything?
No, it's actually complete opposite. Thank you for your question. So Boston Dynamics they use kinematic, fully kinematic modeled robots. So they have the full kinematic model of robots. This needs to be very precisely computed, and that's very computing kind of demanding tasks to have it running all the time on the robot. In difference like biological neural networks, they have no kinematic model, precise kinematic model. They have no precise joints and precise actuators. Everything is kind of quite random. But despite it, like animals, they can act very precisely because they learn from iterative process of errors and trials in kind of reinforcement learning way, and or self-supervised way. And with the adaptive spiking neural networks, you also can do the same. You can upload this network on the robot, and doesn't tell anything about the structure of robot. Just let it kind of explore the world, and it will learn the dynamics of the body of robot itself and how it can use it. So this kind of kinematic free approach. Basically, there is a full area of kinematic free approach, and when you, for example, use soft robots and try to apply soft robots, you have no other choice but to use the kinematic free control for them. But that's just an emerging field in robotic control, and we think that we can really play here with our proposal.
Thanks.
Oh, I have very interesting question about your architecture that is related to arts. And what I want to ask about is there are numerous different Turing tests, and one of them is musical Turing tests, and it is seen by a musical community as the ultimate Turing test. Is the fact that is it possible for a machine to improvise with someone? So can we see this architecture breaking having this test like indistinguishable from human in the improvisation of music as a taken input that is continuous in time and spitting out at the same time some input together, like synchronized with the player, be it a human or a robot player. What are your thoughts about that?
Thank you. Very interesting question indeed. So that's yeah. It seems to me that it is possible because inside of our networks, we not only can apply like the signal, it's recurrent in its nature, and it has ability to produce noise, for example. So it's in terms of behavioral interaction with such a network, it will look like initiative. So it can initiate the activity itself without any kind of difference in inputs, for example. So that might represent some sort of improvisation, and it can adapt on the go to what kind of signal is going in as an input. So yeah, probably it might work. I've never actually heard about this musical Turing test, and I'm curious. Yes, thank you so much for this hint. We'll try something with it.
Yeah, excuse me if I may ask another question. Is it okay?
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Sure. Have you have you researched into the stuff of trying to model medical problems that are something like neurodivergence and some neurological sicknesses that can be modeled? Like, have it been used in medicine to sort of create models of not typical brain activity, which can be sickness?
Yeah, honestly, no, and I think there are better alternatives for this less computational hungry and so on. So if we try to model the brain activity itself, so it seems more optimal to use different kind of models that's already pre-fitted with real reference data. So for this reason, you can use also spiking models, but on the kind of non-learnable dynamics inside of them, and you probably not. I'm not sure if you need such a kind of adaptive plasticity in terms of temporal structure or in terms of spatial structure there. Maybe, but I'm really not sure. It's the best fit for these models. Might be just Izhikevich model will be more efficient because it can represent any kind of reference neural data. So, but representing the neural data itself, it's not our goal. Our goal is to have an adaptive machine learning system which will be able to work with any kind of like data and try to recover or like recognize correlated and so on stuff inside of this data. So it's might be overkill for this task.
Yeah, if I may clarify a bit, for me, this model is sort of analogous with the readings of brain activity directly as a spike model. And it is interesting in sort of ways, try to model this stuff and break the model a bit to see what will happen and see correlation between what we see in the medical data with the real people and what we see with the like sorts of broken models that you have.
Yeah, yes, thank you. I see, but in our models, we not really kind of represent any particular biological system. So by default you can constrain it to some reference biological data, but it seems to me that it will be better to have kind of already pre-fitted models that will work with it, like more efficient, and you can make like very large scale experiments. And it's actually people do this traditional neuroscience, but this kind of
Thank you
model
so much.
it's so much of like adaptation in it for this. Yeah, thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, thank you. And thank you.